Hi everyone, Phil Travis here, and this lesson is on paper writing, particularly how to write these papers that we'll be doing for this class. And basically, if you follow the guidelines here, you should be really clear on what I expect on these papers, and these should also provide a kind of a foundation for understanding how to write essays in the future for other classes. So, to begin with, obviously, the most basic is to follow the directions. These papers should be six to 700 words. I don't mind if you go over 700 words a little bit. If your paper's 1,000 words, that's great. I don't want you to turn in like a 10-page paper on these, but if you go over by 50, 100, 150 words, that's fine. If you go under the minimum, I will deduct points. So under is bad, over is fine. And if you're wondering, 600 to 700 words, these papers should be, again, typed double-spaced in Times New Roman font 12, and that usually works out to be about 2.5 pages, 3 pages. So we're talking about a very workable length for a paper. The papers should be in paragraph form. And what that means is that your paper should be broken up into paragraphs, and each paragraph should have a particular purpose or point within the paper. You have an introductory paragraph, you have maybe 3 body paragraphs, and then you have a conclusion paragraph. And we're going to talk about that a little bit more on the last slide. I want you to cite the work. Make sure you cite the paper. Do not plagiarize. I assume everybody probably has some understanding of what plagiarism is. But in case we're unclear on this, let me just say, plagiarism is stealing somebody's work. It is basically taking information, whether it's a direct quote, or whether it's exact words, or it's just the information, and using it in your own paper without giving somebody credit for it. So what I always say is, when in doubt, cite. If you are using a direct quote, make sure you put it in quotation marks and cite it directly. If you are paraphrasing something, like you got information about the Industrial Revolution or whatever from our textbook, and you paraphrase the information, unless the information is common knowledge, which you'll know if it's common knowledge. Common knowledge is like, Henry Ford developed the Model T. That's common knowledge. You don't have to necessarily cite that. But if you start talking about, how much Henry Ford paid workers and these types of things, you're going to have to cite that information, okay? So if it's not common knowledge, even if you're paraphrasing the information, you have to cite it. For this class, we're just going to use parenthetical citations. So if you cite something, all I want you to do is at the end of the sentence, put before the period, put a parentheses and have the last name of the author and the page number. And then at the end of the paper, I want you to list out the works that you've used in the paper. And when you list that out, I'm not going to be picking on form for this. I want the author, I want the title, and I want the publisher information. Those are the key things I want, and they should come at the end of the paper. So do not plagiarize. Make sure you cite. When in doubt, cite. If you write a whole paragraph, by the way, and you use one source and you don't directly quote and you're just paraphrasing from that source, then you put it in your own words. That's what paraphrasing means. Then you can just cite at the end of the paper. At the end of the paragraph. You can just put the cite at the end of the paragraph. If it's a direct quote, you always must cite at the end of the sentence. If you have multiple sources being used in a paragraph, you need to cite after each sentence. But if you're paraphrasing, taking information from another source, putting it in your own words, then you can just cite at the end of the paragraph. And again, we'll use parenthetical citations, author's last name and the page number in parentheses after the quote, just for simplicity. So a little bit on sources. For this paper, I'm going to ask that you use 3 different types of sources. Okay, you've already got one type of source, and that's your textbook. So boom, you got one checked off, okay? So you've got your textbook. That's one source. The other types of sources you could use, there's a lot of types of sources. You could use a newspaper article. And remember, newspapers, you have to be careful. When you're using a newspaper article as a source, Newspaper articles can be better sources at times, and they can be worse sources at times, and you have to use your best judgment when you encounter those. But a newspaper article, our library online has something called the New York Times Historical, and you can look up newspaper articles that go back to 1851. So you have that. You have the ability to access our online library and access those sources. And if you have problems with that, go to the library and ask them, and they'll show you how to do this. Libraries can be very, very helpful sources in writing historical paper. So you could use a newspaper article. You could use another historical monograph. A historical monograph is a fancy way of saying a book written by a historian. So you have your textbook as one book. The other source could be a historical monograph in which you use a book that was written by a historian on the topic, and you get information from that. You could also use a journal article. Journal articles, again, these can be found with your online databases by our library. So you can go online to our library and you can look up literally thousands of journal articles. You can search the particular topic you're looking for, refine it, and find articles that are written by scholars. I want articles that are written by legitimate scholars. But that's another possible type of source you can use. So you got your textbook. You could use a historical monograph. You could use a newspaper article. You could use a journal article written on these subjects. So I want you to get basically 3 different sources. It shouldn't be that hard. You just have to go and look for them. There should be journal articles written on every possible topic you might write about. There's books that are written on these, on every topic. Depending on the topic, you'll probably be able to find newspaper articles on them too. So that shouldn't be too hard. You just have to kind of go and use the library. I wanted to just, inform us on good, bad sources, primary sources, and secondary sources. On this paper, if you were ever writing like a dissertation or a book, the best sources are primary sources. Primary sources are first-hand accounts. So if you were writing about United States foreign policy during the Vietnam War, the best sources would be sources that demonstrated that you went and looked at the actual government documents themselves, the primary sources, the first-hand account, and used that research to construct your narrative. A primary source means it's a first-hand account, so it hasn't gone through the process of other figures interpreting the source. Now, on a paper like this is a short paper. It's really an exercise. You don't have to use a primary source. You could use a primary source, and primary sources, they can be letters that somebody wrote. They can be accounts that somebody wrote. You can find primary sources in all kinds of different books. There's many books that use primary sources as examples within a text, and so you have books that are written as collections of primary sources, and you could find those depending on your topic. You also could use images as a source as well, like photos and so forth, depending again, or artwork depending on the topic. But a primary source is a first-hand account, and generally historians regard those as the best sources because they go right to the original source. And don't have any interpretation going through them. And then you can take those sources and interpret, the sources. Secondary sources are secondhand accounts. So your textbook is a secondary source. A newspaper article can be both a primary source and a secondary source. It really depends on the nature of the article. Books, journal articles, almost always these are our secondary sources. And secondary sources are good to use, and most of the sources that you'll use in this paper, I would assume that generally almost everyone will use secondary sources, and that's fine, but I want your secondary sources to be good sources. And what that means is that I want your sources to be written by professional scholars. So a good source and a bad source when it comes to writing about history, beyond the primary source, which is obviously, depending on how you use it, is obviously a good source. But for a topic like this, we're writing about history, the way to determine if something is a good source or a bad source is by determining whether or not the author is a legitimate scholar who's done legitimate academic work. Okay, so I want sources that are written by professional scholars. And in looking at an article or looking at a book, it should be pretty easy for you to figure that out. Of course, a newspaper article, if you use a newspaper article, generally you would be using that more as a primary source. And so that doesn't really apply for something like that. Or if you used a painting or a picture, that's a little bit different. Those are really primary sources that you'll be interpreting. But in terms of books, I want sources written by professional scholars. By contrast, bad sources for this class would be like, biased authors, non-academic, books that are written by political commentators who have a particular political purpose. Books that are written about history by individuals who, are not professional scholars. And you should be able to tell those by examining the books. So don't use biased authors or non-academic sources. I want academic and scholarly sources. Last, and then we'll finish this up so I won't take up too much of your time, just about what I expect in the introduction, the body, and the conclusion. So you're writing this paper in paragraph form. And so you break the paper up into paragraphs. Each paragraph is basically supposed to convey a particular point relating to the paper. Probably the most important paragraph is the introductory paragraph. The introductory paragraph is where you tell the reader what the paper's about. It's where you draw the reader in. It's where you give the reader the opportunity to either be like, oh my gosh, this is so boring, I'm not going to read on, or wow, this is intriguing, let me look further. So the introduction is really important. It's in the introduction where you want to draw the reader in. Sometimes an author can do this with a narrative hook, telling a little story. The air pollution was terrible on this day in London. People wore masks over their face, and this demonstrates the significance of the environmental damage caused by the Industrial Revolution. Whatever, okay? I'm just kind of making that up in my head. But in some cases, you might begin an introduction with a narrative hook that tells a little story and draws the reader in, okay? The introductory section, generally, you want to finish it off with a thesis statement. And the thesis statement is your overall point. Okay, what is it that you want to argue in the paper? These papers should not be simple summaries, okay? The Industrial Revolution happened in this period. These things happened and these things happened, blah, blah, blah. Okay, that's not what I want to see. I want to see you make an argument about this. And you don't have to freak out and be like, how do I make an original argument? Because making an original argument is really difficult. And for a paper like this, you don't have to worry about that, okay? You don't have to reinvent the wheel, okay? You can make a very simple argument. Example of the thesis statement here. The media plays a key role in the development of the perceptions of the American people. Or if you wanted to do one on the Industrial Revolution, you're not going to be writing on the media. That's just an example that I used kind of off the top of my head. But, if you did the Industrial Revolution, the development of the Industrial Revolution transformed the way people live, but also had an extremely negative effect on the environment. Okay? So your thesis statement is your overall point. It is your argument. You need to make an argument in the paper. You need to make a point. What does it mean? Why should the reader read on? What is the overall thing you're saying about the paper? That's really important. After you've done the thesis statement in the introduction, after you've introduced the topic and you've finished it off with a thesis statement that sort of tells the reader, hey, this is what I'm arguing, this is why you should read on, you have a body section. And the body section is the area where you provide the evidence. This is the area where you're going to particularly draw on your sources to say, well, the Industrial Revolution transformed the environment because, 90% of the forest in this area was deforested, was cut down. It's just an example. Or you could look at how the media portrayed the Vietnam War, or so forth. This is just an example that I kind of have at the top of my head because it's kind of a pet peeve of mine, something I like. But the body is where you provide evidence. It's where you say, okay, I've got my thesis, I've got my point. Now, here's the evidence that proves my point. Okay, the Industrial Revolution transformed the landscape of the world, and now I'm going to use evidence that discusses, the manner in which, industrial technology resulted in extinction of animals, or in expansion of population in the globe, or in deforestation, or of pollution of waterways, and so forth. Okay, all the things you will find out in the sources that you use for the paper. And then finally, last but certainly not least, is the conclusion. A conclusion paragraph is integral. It's where you summarize the paper. It's where you summarize what the point was that you made in the paper. So, in fact, you can look at the introduction and the conclusion as like bookending your evidence. The introduction says, hey, here's the topic. This is what I'm going to argue. This is what this is about. Then the body provides evidence, okay? And then the conclusion bookends it by saying, okay, this is what we've written about. This is what we've argued here. And this is why we should think about this as Americans or as world citizens. Please indent all of your paragraphs and make sure your papers are double-spaced. Okay, I think that should be pretty clear for you guys. So let's hopefully do some really great papers, and let me know if you have any questions. Thanks, guys.